psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Saw a new client for our first session at my home practice. We seemed to click and work together fine. He said he wanted to work through some trauma he'd experienced when he was physically attacked by a previous psychologist. Hearing about terrible psychologists always riles me up, so I was immediately on his side. When I talked with my supervisor about the case a week later, she asked me his full name, which never happened, so I was weirded out immediately. She googled the name then and there and wordlessly handed me her iPad. It was full of news articles about this client and his attacks on psychologists in my local area. I obviously did not see him again, but I was nervous for ages because he knew where I lived. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts, taekwondo. If I remember correctly, was really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks. And at one point, accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere. Was mostly blind. And the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner. It came literal centimeters from my face. And I felt the impact of it against the air. Like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world. He would have been horrified if it had connected. Because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a suddenly firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No, I did not. Not me, but a friend, who is the patient, has what's described as treatment-resistant psychosis. She's not a scary person at all. In fact, she's really sweet and caring. But she hears voices that tell her that her parents and little brother will be raped and tortured if she doesn't follow what they say. Sometimes the voices convince her that staff members at the psychiatric intensive care unit she's on are working for the government and trying to run experiments on her and put bugs under her skin. So her voices will tell her to attack staff members. Not super often. But it happens. Whenever it does. She feels terrible afterwards and will cry for hours on end and beg for forgiveness. One of her voices also makes her do her ritual, in which she strips down completely naked. And sometimes eats her own sheet. She herself is not a scary person. Psychosis itself is such a scary and heartbreaking illness. Because she's not a violent person and has tons of compassion and empathy for others. Psychotic does not equal psycho or sociopath. I'm a therapist. But not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident I think, so I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time and I generally enjoyed working with them. Once when I was a medical student I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to heal you and heal myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his woofer beater had dark red-brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. Not a psych, but my dad is a retired forensic one. He's got far too many stories, but his first ever murder case decades ago as a noob was a rough one. It involved a guy who kept asking this girl out. She made it clear numerous times that she wasn't interested. But the guy wasn't having it and just kept harassing her. Finally, one day he followed her home where he stabbed her parents and the family dog to death. I don't really want to hear about any of his other cases. Clinical psychologist in training here. I've never been afraid. But my friend had a client once who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that could break confidentiality. I will say that he had issues with masturbating too much and not doing much else. And at one point asked my friend if they could watch porn together in the next session so he could show her what he does. At another time, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching his big dick through his pants a bit. Totally inappropriate behavior. Obviously, this client had lots of other issues. But when these things came up, her supervisor took her off the case because it wasn't suitable for training and my friend didn't feel safe. A 9-year-old I used to teach in lockdown special education mistook my assistant's move towards me as aggressive and attempted to hit her with a desk. I wasn't scared for myself. Definitely scared for both the boy, a real sweetheart who just got triggered, and the assistant, total itch to me and the kids. Everything turned out okay. I hurried the boy off to his therapist and the assistant quit immediately and we went back to a normalish classroom. Not a psychologist, but I work at a psych hospital. Your first experience with a patient attempting to seriously injure or kill you is always frightening. But most of the time, at least at my workplace, it's more heartbreaking than scary. Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations. But sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 AM and he didn't remember a second of it. Any of it. He had hallucinations before. But they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why. As it was 3 AM. And he replied eerily calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. Not a psychiatrist or psychologist. RN on acute psych unit. I've had a few. But one that really stands out was a young and rather built fella. Perfect example of a sociopath. Charming when he wanted something. Zero capacity for empathy. Lack of remorse. Very manipulative. If you've seen the movie American Psycho, he nailed the role of Patrick Bateman. I won't give out too much information because I love my job and want to keep it. But no. Just very cold. And I've never seen such an evil and malicious smile. Had that grin on his face seconds before assaulting a staff member. I'm not a psychologist. But I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Obligatory. Not a psychologist. but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school. In front of a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it. But the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid. And because he didn't give a duck about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial. To the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated. So it was a very muted, mumbled, and through 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher. But he knew who she was, and one day he asked me would MRS X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car. I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out. And I had to report it to the sped teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the shit out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him, in case he did or said anything to upset her. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him and she let her guard down. This time though, he was now 20 years old and 6 foot tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him. And I'm 6'4" 225 pounds. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily. And she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My brother-in-law is an amazing guy and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years. But the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously ducked up people for a living. Let's just say, Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing shit. She's tough as nails and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently this guy was either a serial rapist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile and she fit it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures, and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims. Well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night. Despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it like a hunter-prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter of fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Edit. Obviously giving tokens and letters is not only creepy but violates the doctor-patient relationship. She would decline very firmly and clearly. And I guess maybe some stuff was intercepted before he had the chance to try and actually give it to her. It's been about 10 years since I heard the story, but it stuck with me. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man, in his 30s-ish, who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then grade their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6-7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13. But he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice in friend's house. And while she was gone, he'd go back and grade her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls. It's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful. BC if he was, he is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his I feel terrible-esque were transparent and so full of shit it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to. But with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. Edit. Grammar mistake clarity. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in 1S, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean he was like 6'5". Gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go toe to toe with. We would sometimes have to call police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him and go nope and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to 1S. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room and then walks out naked. Dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away and looks down at me. I mean way down. As I'm only 5'3". He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no. He's leaving and I'd better step aside. So I did. You'd better believe I stepped the duck aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the grounds, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into his secure room. However, once he is in there, they are not allowed to restrain past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we go into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later, I'm no longer security or live in the town. Lo and behold. It's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. At one point our lines to the bar coincided. And I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me. Looked down and then looked back up and stared. Hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a tad scared. Worked in a mental health facility for children for 6 months. Saddest 6 months of my life. Top 3 shocking things that happened were: 1. Severely schizophrenic 16-year-old teenage boy who was around 5 feet tall, 90 pounds, would get put into a straitjacket during one of his episodes. And he could physically take down the 6 feet 3 230 pounds male tech while being in a straitjacket. He would speak in voices that almost sounded demonic while doing it. It was horrifying. 2. Severely schizophrenic 17-year-old girl would hide in a corner. Wait till her targeted worker would walk by. Stick her hands down the front of her pants into her vag. Grab a handful of period blood. And smack us across the face with the blood. She did this to me more than once and I had to go to the hospital more than once, during work hours, to get tested. Especially when the blood would get close to our mouths and eyes. 3. Very sweet, but very non-verbal 13-year-old boy would masturbate. Constantly. Pants down. Pen 15 out. Masturbating. All day. All night. In front of everyone and anyone. He had elephantiasis of his pen 15 and part of one of his legs. So these events were not only disturbing and inappropriate. There was literally a practical problem with him taking his 1.5 foot long pen 15 out of his pants. It seriously took 2 people to pack it back in. And then he would drop his pants and take it out all over again. A few people had unpredictable anger and outbursts that could be scary at times. And once a husband brought a gun to a couple's therapy session and threatened to kill himself wife. Luckily we were able to calm the situation down. But things like that can end badly. And you always have to be aware of that possibility when emotions run high. Oh man, once I was psychotic, bipolar, in hospital and imagined my parents and little brother were there and I thought they came up an escalator into the hospital. Not real. And my dad was about to be beaten up by these guys. I attacked the nurse trying to get to them. Pushed her over. Tried to pull out my catheter. And ran around looking to save my dad with nurses trying to hold me down. I feel absolutely horrid looking back because I really hurt that nurse, and by the time I came to and wanted to apologize her shift had long ended and I never saw her again to say sorry. Not a psych, but I briefly worked at an inpatient psych hospital, and during my training a support code was called because a woman who'd had abdominal surgery had ripped open the wound and stitches and was saying over and over, "I can die now. I can die now," as she reached inside of her wound. I lasted only a month. But never felt fear like I did there.